छोड़।
This idea that cinema is a visual medium, is a visual discipline, perhaps it was a visual discipline. It is, I think, in my mind, no longer a visual discipline. And it again connects with the idea of the meaning. I find that if you look back, there was a great development, in Europe during the Renaissance. And parallel to that, there was great development everywhere else of a certain visual culture. Especially during the Renaissance, they developed perspective. Perspective meant a new way of appropriating space. They added a quality of foreground, background, middle ground, and the reality, perspective resulted in a kind of a reality which is a new appropriation, a new meaning. It resulted in many different things. It was perhaps the greatest revolution of modern times. It created cartography, where whole map making changed and colonization was possible. It changed the whole art scene completely. It changed music because it created in Western music foreground, middle ground, background, the whole system of symphonic music took on a different turn after the perspective. Even the idea of literature altered. For instance, the idea of convergence, when two parallel lines are not supposed to converge, but in perspective that's what we are taught, which is just a defect of the eye, that the lines actually come to a convergence. If you look at literature and music in the West, you will find that from the earlier Greek time, the narrative took on a new form altogether. The narrative took on the form of argument, counter-argument, and resolution. So where the convergence took place of an argument and a counter-argument became a climax. So it's very surprising that even in music, in Western music, this whole idea of small climaxes coming to a big climax, it's like the idea of perspective and convergence. If you look at the narrative before Renaissance, you find that there are stories, that are like in Mahabharata or any other epical text. You will find that there are arguments, counter-arguments, and it goes on and on. But in the narrative, if someone is going to kill somebody, for example, it just happens in one verse, at the end. But what Renaissance gave was a strange development towards the climax, and it became a universal form, completely universal form. Since then, it has existed, and it is dominating our lives. It's dominating our lives to such an extent that we cannot even describe an event. If I have to describe to you an event, a small event, and if I don't resolve it, if I don't bring it to a climax, I don't resolve it, bring it to that kind of resolution, and leave it open, you will feel I'm not communicating enough. You will feel that I'm not making my point at all. So all the efforts that have been made by modern artists, modern filmmakers, I include Arvindan, and I have done my own modest contribution, where one has attempted to keep forms open-ended, not coming to a conclusion of that sort, always run into difficulty with the audience. Because the culture is so deep, the idea of the climax, even in the most vulgar sense, it's just an issue so deep-rooted in us, that we cannot imagine the actual pleasure of existence, actual pleasure of knowing, understanding, without necessarily reaching an end. And I think that appropriation of image, that the Renaissance created, which spread all over the world, gave us, a kind of imagery, a kind of visual culture that we haven't got rid of till now. Till now, that continues, and actually, I think we are suffering from it. When somebody says, that he's making a film on a piece of literature, and that literature is evocative of some images, that literature makes him feel as if there are some images coming to his mind when he reads. Those images are an abstraction for literature. That is not the material for literature. When I use some words and I create that absent image which is behind those words, then I'm creating an abstraction which is a source of experience for me. But suppose if I were to film that image that the literature is creating, it comes to nothing. That wonderful tree created by a poem, I can't film it, because when I go and film a tree, what can I do with it? I can't do anything with it, it's just a tree. So what would I do? I will create more visual effects. I would force some kind of lighting on it, I would force some kind of special effect on it, I will create some kind of... I will force the meaning on the image, because the image itself has no meaning. So what I'm trying to say now, that we have come to a stage with television, advertising, consumerism, that the whole visual culture is become totally meaningless. And it is, I think, for filmmakers, and I'm actually, what I'm suggesting to you is not something that I have myself accomplished. I'm actually raising this question for myself, and I'm raising it for you so that we can have a debate, and I'm in the midst of it. It's not as if I've solved any problem. But I find that as long as we do not understand this, that the power of the image is finished. And it is precisely for this reason that the power of the image has been bought by consumerist advertisers, televisions. It's finished. It's precisely because of that now there is special effects. That the whole idea of the special effect is to actually again engulf the audience, to take the audience into this notion of image consumerism. So from here, where can we go? Where can cinema go? How can cinema actually create a new relationship, a new whole? Earlier, when we wanted to structure a film, we obviously thought in the vocabulary of images, and we structured our work. But today, if you do that, if I find a well-composed shot, it doesn't do anything to me. It doesn't do anything. Because the whole, the basic position of the appropriation of space, with which we are organizing the space and making an image. When we are using the space, we are creating an image, is based on this dichotomy of a sacred space and a profane space. And that's how the whole relationship with space works. That in society itself, there are areas, there is a temple that is supposed to be sacred. Then there is a brothel which is not supposed to be sacred, which is profane. There are different shades of profanity and sacredness with which space confronts us. Anywhere, any society, in any geography, you will find this division. So that a certain kind of relationship is expected when you go to a place, which becomes somebody else, when you go to a so-called profane space, And this dichotomy, in actual fact, the idea of morality is anyway come to an end. If you really ask me, the whole moral value today, the idea of being moral or immoral, it is of no consequence today. The way, how rapidly the whole world is being globalized and developing, more and more there is at stake about the question of the moral and the immoral, So the relationship with this relationship with space, this relationship with creating images has lost its meaning completely. So I believe that, and this is a topic I've been involved with for the last 1 or 2 years, I believe that when we make films, we always seem to forget that a film is expressing itself in images, but actually it is also happening in time. Film, to me, is not a visual medium. It is actually a temporal medium. It is a medium of time. And that is the difficulty. I think when you enter the realm of duration, for example, enter the realm of rhythm, you therefore enter the realm of tension, then it's material how the thing is composed. Because in the idea of the composition is again the same dichotomy, between the sacred and profane. And I'm composing a shot, I place my camera here, then I move my camera from here to here, and I tell my cameraman that this is the space, which is sacred, which means what? meaningful, significant. That is what is going to make my meaning. In that, if suddenly something comes, suppose something falls or something that was not wanted comes in, something which is at random, which is not required, comes in, and it completely destroys that idea of the significance of that shot. So you say, no, cut it, I want to take it again. Because all this nonsense came in some shares, I don't want that. Because he has created a sacred space. By sacred, I again mean only significant or meaningful. I don't mean any religious or moral sense. But it is that, because that which is at random, what is at random, is making this whole thing meaningless. But in the life that we are leading, there is nothing but randomness. By sacred, I again mean only significant or meaningful. I don't mean any religious or moral sense. But it is that, because that which is at random, what is at random, is making this whole thing meaningless. But in the life that we are leading, there is nothing but randomness today. Violence is random, our lives are random, our developments are random. I mean, there is so much randomness in our life today. It has become totally unstructured. And in fact, if you cannot make a film, this random development of mobiles, for example, it's actually, I'm not disturbed by it, and that's what I'm trying to say. That this randomness, in fact, is not a disturbance. In fact, I'm trying to say how to include this randomness, how to make this randomness a part of our expression, a part of our meaning. How can we, for example, include this and then make a new kind of a whole that is able to embrace this uncertainty, randomness, and not go by structure, ideation, and just make a film which is one idea. That, I think, will only happen if we find a new relationship with the idea of duration, time, and think that how, if a shot starts and lasts for a certain time, like music, for example, there's only tone, but how long the phrase lasts, how long somebody is using something, how short it is, how long. What we call in music, which I'm also very involved in, like particularly in Surat, which is a North Indian form of music, and it is actually based on recitative traditions. And recitation itself is dependent upon what we call risv and diri. There are three forms of. But there are many other factors that are temporal, that describe time. How can time affect, our narration? How can we actually not care for the idea of the composition and include the randomness? How can somebody acting give me a sense of the kind of attention, the quality of attention? Once the quality, what are we looking for in a work of art? I think it's that particular quality of attention that the work is able to generate. That's the power of a work of art. That when you see, it's not a question of, somebody could be preoccupied with some political issues, social issues, that's another matter. But ultimately, if it's a work of art, it is a certain quality of attention. And it is able to displace. And it is this attention that is at stake, because it is faced with that kind of randomness. And how can we include this, And I think this can only happen if we are going to look at cinema in a completely different way now. I have a feeling, somehow, I'm not too sure, because I'm a film man, and most of my films I made in 35mm, like all of us. I probably made one film in 16. I think that the new development of the digital has something in it that fascinates me. I'm not too certain as to how can it solve this problem. But the idea of fragment, for example, which was in our minds during the time we make films, like a fragment is a shot. And a shot is very important. A shot is a spatial, like made of space, fragment, which is very important for film. So, and it's a construction of such fragments. So that when we take a shot, it's very important to say, start camera. And when we end the shot, we also very important, cut it. And in fact, often directors, when they say, cut it, or whatever expression they have, you can almost know whether he likes the shot or doesn't like it, you know. So that becomes a very structured sort of space, you know, that he has created. When you look at video, I mean, it's ridiculous. Nobody will say, start video, cut it. It doesn't make sense. Fragment doesn't make any sense anymore. Because the whole relationship with the space is altered. The video is forever. You put it on, it goes on for 1 hour at least, minimum. And now they're doing the hard disk, it will go on the whole day, maybe. Where there is no notion of the fragment anymore. So the idea of duration is completely altered. Whereas we were dealing with fragments, now we don't have to deal with them. So that there is nothing that I can tell an actor, for example, that within this shot you have to do this. That's not the idea anymore, you know. I mean, it will take on a completely different form altogether. The story will take on a different form. The whole idea of shot taking will take on a different. Shot itself will lose meaning, to my mind. You know, will that happen with the digital? Can cinema do it? You know, I'm very uncertain. But I, to this very wonderful occasion, wanted to raise this question and perhaps have a dialogue with you. I will stop here now, and I'll be very glad to join you in a dialogue if you have any questions. Thank you. That motion picture, from the time it was invented, the big thing about motion picture was movement. That the photograph didn't have movement, and suddenly you had something on screen which was moving. And therefore it was called movies or motion picture or everything to do with movement, and that was a big delight, even to see birds flying or train coming or whatever. But as we came, like long history of cinema, and after, say, World War II, as in fact I'm citing Deleuze now, it so happened that two great filmmakers suddenly realized, and these two great filmmakers were Bresson from France and Ozu from Japan, that they had to make the camera static. In fact, not only static, but even make the characters most of the time sitting. So the idea of motion or movement was in fact negated. So also in Bresson, although Bresson's camera moves a little more, but it's never more than a mid-shot distance away from the characters. It has hardly one lens, 50 mm. It never takes a strong angle to the subject. The scenes are not very strongly lit. It doesn't do anything that is, to my mind, visually striking. I don't think Bresson and Ozu are visual artists. That we are now, after Ozu and Bresson, we are faced with this question. We are faced with this question at how the sense of time in cinema comes only when the visual is killed. I shall tell you, for example, there are many films you will see in festivals, that when you actually set up a composition, it's an image. When the audience is looking at that image, there is a certain time required to read that image. Once you have read the image, and I really mean reading in the sense, suppose I give you a static shot of anything in front of you, it has to come to an end. It has to come to an end and you have to cut it. The whole experiment of Varor, when somebody is sleeping for 3 hours, is another matter. I'm talking of normal filmmaking all over the world. You have to cut that image. Well, you might think that you have to cut on account of the way the narrative is developing, or on account of the exigencies of that particular scene. But I think that once the image is read, and there is nothing anymore to read, if you hold that shot on still, then you actually confront the idea of the duration of that shot. And in order to make audience experience that duration, there are many films and filmmakers who just hold on to the image, where nothing is happening, where nothing is developing further. So I would say that it is ironical, and I don't mean to say that every film that has to show a direct experience of time must have static shots. No, that's not my proposition is that is what caused, for the first time in cinema, a completely different kind of experience. I'm talking of a different quality of attention. Because attention is not a feature of space. Attention must happen in time. The wonderful thing about film or cinema, good cinema, great cinema, is the quality of attention it evokes. That the kind of quality of attention a film is able to evoke is all there is to a film, as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't matter to me when I see Mizoguchi and I see Ugetsu Monogatari, after about half an hour, the whole quality of attention, the internalization, is extraordinary. And where does it come from? Where does that feeling come in Ozu? Because everything is so ordinary. The characters are so ordinary. Camera is static. Where does it come from Bresson? So my own view in this matter, which I have not included in my article, is that over the years, when you look at the history of cinema, there have broadly two kinds of films. If I may use such a broad categorization, I don't really mean to say that this is category A, this is category B, but it is to enable a conversation that there has been the idea of representational film and a non-representational film. And I think that might be a platform with which we can begin to discuss. There is a big divide between the two. When Bresson, in his book, The Notes on the Cinematographer, says that he has given up representation and taken up fragmentation, he actually means it. And this idea of representation is so deep in us, and I include myself, that I think I have traveled all over the world because of my profession. I have never seen a filmmaker who has achieved the quality Bresson achieved. I have never seen one. Because in the end, every film that is made outside of Bresson succumbs to the idea of representation. The idea of representation, in my mind, is very simple. You already have a thought, you already have an idea as to what you want to show. Therefore you shoot in a certain way, and by shooting you want to accomplish that idea. You might have a narrative, but within that narrative, a shot is therefore a representation of a certain feeling, certain thought, certain idea that you might have. Whereas in case of Bresson, when he says that a shot does not represent anything, but actually when he means non-acting, there is no acting. When he says there are no parts, there are no parts. When he says that the character who's acting should not be given any intention, that means I cannot ask the character that, well, you are feeling very jealous, so you must make your face like that. Impossible. He's saying that's an impossibility in cinematography. So if you cannot give intention to the character, you cannot have characterization. So a shot is nothing. On the whole, of course, Bresson saw to it that when he made the film, the character of that film, the tones of that film, that he was very keen on certain kind of contrast, certain kind of diffusion. But that's for the whole film to create, it's like tuning an instrument. Like the musicians tune their instrument, he would also tune the camera. And then, of course, when the question of filming starts, he never directed, because even he seriously said that the point is not in directing somebody, but to direct oneself. All this book is not just a collection of poetic aphorisms. It's actually true, what he says. And that is precisely the reason that people who want to follow that path, not as to copy Bresson, but to follow that tradition of presentation, they are not able to. Because they make the actors act, they make the lighting which expresses something, they choose angles that are expressive, they in the end succumb to the idea of the visual and representation, which is of course a very old tradition for humanity. The idea of representation is very, very old. The idea of fragmentation and presentation is very new. These categorizations are normally done to broadly understand, So I would think that, for example, when I look at a work where the literal meaning of the image is abandoned, that means if I am shooting a glass and I have lit up in a way where it takes on certain metaphorical extensions, that means that one meaning that the glass has actually transforms into another meaning, because I take a certain angle on the glass, the lighting is done in a certain way, the water is reflecting itself in a certain way. It means that the literal meaning of the image has been abandoned and you have gone on to an extended meaning, which could be described by any figure of speech. Metaphor, metonymy being hyperbole, hundreds of figures of speech that describe the transformation of that object into a new thing, a new metaphor. Now, the other aspect of presentation. In my mind, in the presentation, there is no extension. The literal quality of the image is accepted. A glass is a glass. So, I believe that in Bresson, a glass doesn't stand for something else, it stands for itself. When the literal meaning of an image is accepted, then how do you create meaning? Because obviously, the only way that we have understood for centuries is to create metaphors and extensions, that it was something being done, it actually means something else. And now you have something, and I accept the literal meaning of it. How do I create meaning? I believe that when you accept the literal meaning and don't push the image into an extended meaning, then the only way you can create meaning is out of sequence. That has two possibilities. That the sequence is discernible, therefore there is a certain kind of a narrative, and it is because there is something now, something happening now, something happening now. So a shot, as in Bresson, will mean nothing. If you look at one shot, nothing. It is photographically nothing. I'm saying nothing meaning it's done like that. But a shot by itself has no meaning. But when it is in sequence, and where the sequence is discernible, it is one kind, and the extreme of that would be that although it is in sequence, the sequence is not discernible. That actually it is made in a way, like in Mizoguchi, you sometimes lose the idea of the sequence. But when the literal meaning of an image is accepted, the only way out, for meaning to come is how shots are joined, one after the other. It is not the Einstein's idea of 1 + 1 making 3. In fact, it is ellipses, the gap between those cuts. The gaps that are between cuts form the meaning. And I believe not just in visual arts, but also in literature and many other areas, there is a very distinct division between representation and presentation. For example, I believe that the great poetry of Basho, the haiku poet, is the kind of poetry that I also admire, because in the haiku, the word has no more meaning than itself. It doesn't take on metaphorical meanings in Basho. If you say an old pond, it's an old pond. He's not saying anything more. Then he says the frog jumps. Nothing else. Then he says the sound of splash, or whatever, however you want to translate, of water. It's because I say an ancient pond, a frog jumps, sound of water. It's because of the sequence that suddenly a new experience comes into being. And this is the kind of presentation that I'm talking about, that there is even in literature. But literature, as cinema, as painting, is normally only preoccupied with representation, with metaphors, metonymy. I feel as if the whole sky is coming, or some, you know that, it happens in poetry of all kinds, in all languages. But to my mind, Basho was exceptional. Never ever will you find in his haiku that the word abandons, its literal meaning and takes on an extended meaning. Accidents happen when you shoot, and accidents are always better than what is planned, more often than not. The reason I think again is that why I keep talking of Bresson is it's very well known that he used to take 30 takes, 40 takes. Sometimes, having done that, he used to take the second take. But inevitably he will make the actors, non-actors, whom we call models, go through many takes. So for him, setting up the shot, setting the camera, giving action to the actor was only a mechanism. It was not the object to be realized or executed. And that's where the problem is, I think. When I speak of either representational or non-representational cinema, the idea of time is always beyond, the idea of control. That's what I feel. So he would wait.
after having given the action to the actor and cameraman and then go through the scene, shoot it, and he would not accept the take unless there was a kind of it had become outside of the control area, that the actor suddenly did something that was not planned, or the cameraman did something, or the way the entire take took place wasn't what they had planned. What they had planned, therefore, was not a plan to be executed, but just a kind of mechanism which will bring the actor inside the room, make him sit down. Please turn that off. Excuse me. Bring the actor, sit down on the table, get out. Simple actions which are like mechanisms, And he made them go through. Sometimes he took only 2 or 3 shots a day. Because the accident must take place. The accident is beyond control of execution. And filmmakers will always tell you, I was making a film and I was shooting a scene at a very old camera and I had to run it on 150 frames. And I was shooting from a high sort of skyscraper. And it was old camera, Mitchell camera. And then when we started shooting, it was so reverberating, The whole camera was kind of, shaking. So that while I took a very lengthy shot, the focus ring was moving. And then focus ring in the opposite direction. So by the time the shot ended, it was out focus. And I thought it was a great shot, my cameraman thought it was a great shot, and Sani was my cameraman, And the assistant said that I'm sorry, that I didn't realize that this is an old camera and shaking, so the focus ring was moving. Everything must be out of focus. So we were quite disappointed and we had to take another take. So we took another take and put a tape on the focus ring so that it doesn't move. And we took the shot. But when I saw the 2 shots, I actually liked the one that went out of focus. It had such a great quality that I never planned. That is very important, that Bresson actually followed a certain development in Christian philosophy, beginning with St. Augustine, who was the first one to talk of grace. And then, in Holland, there was a man who picked it up, called Janssen, that philosophy of grace, which meant that it chooses its own recipient, that there is no action in the world, there is no virtuous or such path that can lead you to grace. The grace will fall on its own accord, on the object it wants to fall. So, a donkey, in case of Bresson, can become a saint, a pickpocket can become a saint, a young girl can become a saint. It chooses its own recipient. So the idea of the grace, actually, if you think, is very different from the idea that is followed by Jesuits. And there was a very big debate between Janssen and Bresson was Pascal in France. And Pascal had a very big debate with the Jesuits. And the Jesuits, of course, prescribed a certain moral code, a certain virtuous path in order to achieve something. Whereas Pascal, in fact, talking on the lines of Jansenism, said that it will lead to nothing because you have no faith. You have not faith on whom it will choose. So in case of Bresson, although Bresson himself never extensively spoke about it, because I read quite a lot of text, only once he mentioned this. And I also met him once, 15 minutes or so, in Paris. I could get to him. And I understood that for him, that idea of the accident, the idea of such random intrusion into the shot, is an act of grace. Therefore, he wasn't creating, he was merely recognizing. The work of a filmmaker is recognition. It is not a work of somebody creating.